The deep, muffled quiet of a winter evening had settled over the ancient pine forests of the north, wrapping the world in a heavy, slumbering blanket of pure, untouched white. Large, lazy flakes of snow drifted down from a vast sky, a sky painted in the deepest shades of crushed slate and bruised violet. The snow tumbled through the still, freezing air with a slow, hypnotic grace, swirling ever so gently before coming to rest. Each flake caught the faint, silvery glow of the rising moon, shimmering for a brief, beautiful moment, like scattered dust from a distant, sleeping star, before settling soundlessly onto the heavy, drooping boughs of the evergreen trees. In this secluded, peaceful corner of the world, time did not march forward with the frantic, hurried ticking of a clock. Rather, it breathed. It breathed slow and deep, like a dormant giant resting quietly beneath the frost, completely undisturbed by the rushing affairs of the lands far beyond the mountains. Walking along the winding, snow-cushioned path that led toward the summit of the craggy hill was Elias. He was a man whose life was measured not in miles travelled, nor in loud triumphs, but in pages gently turned and ancient fragile bindings lovingly restored. A humble travelling bookbinder by trade, Elias possessed a remarkably quiet, patient soul. He moved with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a man who knew, deep in his bones, that nothing truly beautiful or lasting could ever be rushed. He wore a thick, heavy coat of dark charcoal wool, the collar turned high against the gentle, biting kiss of the winter cold. A long, thickly knitted scarf of deep maroon was wrapped securely around his neck, holding in the warmth of his body. Slung carefully over his right shoulder was a weathered leather satchel, its surface scarred, polished, and softened by years of travel, holding the precious, simple tools of his solitary craft. Every step Elias took produced a soft, immensely satisfying crunch in the fresh, powdery snow, a rhythmic, repeating sound that seemed to lull the surrounding forest into an even deeper state of profound tranquility. His breath bloomed in the crisp, freezing air like small, ephemeral clouds of pale mist, instantly swept away by a breeze, so faint it barely managed to stir the sleeping pine needles. He was not weary, though he had travelled far for many days, in a swaying, wooden carriage before walking this final, quiet mile. Instead of exhaustion, a profound, heavy sense of peace washed over him. It was a feeling of arriving at a destination that his spirit had always known, a feeling of coming home to a sanctuary he had never before seen with his own eyes. Through the thick, mesmerizing veil of the gently falling snow, the magnificent silhouette of the northern castle finally emerged from the tree line. It did not loom with the harsher, imposing angles of a fortress built for war or defense. Instead, it sat nestled into the natural contour of the snow-covered mountain like an ancient protective guardian that had grown directly from the bedrock. Its massive stone towers were rounded and softened by centuries of wind and weather, their conical roofs currently wearing thick, pristine caps of freshly fallen snow. Warm, inviting amber light spilled from the deeply recessed, mullioned windows, casting long, golden beams across the unbroken white surface of the courtyard. The light seemed to promise a deep sanctuary, a warm, glowing refuge from the long, dark stretch of the winter night. Elias slowly approached the grand double doors of the castle. They were fashioned from dark, solid oak, thick and heavy, bound in bands of tarnished iron that had long ago surrendered any harshness to the slow passage of time. He reached out with a thick, leather-gloved hand and pushed against the smooth wood. The great doors yielded with a surprisingly smooth, heavy glide, silently parting to grant him entry into the unknown. As he stepped carefully over the raised stone threshold, the biting, crisp chill of the winter evening was instantly, wonderfully replaced by an enveloping, luxurious wall of warmth. It was as if the ancient castle itself had suddenly exhaled a long, deeply held breath, wrapping him instantly in a profoundly comforting, invisible embrace. The vast entrance hall was a masterclass in quiet, understated grandeur. The high walls were constructed of large, smoothly hewn grey stones that somehow absorbed the golden light and radiated a steady ambient heat back into the space. Beneath his snow-dusted boots, the hard stone floor was entirely obscured by an ocean of thick, richly woven rugs. They overlapped one another in faded, elegant hues of deep crimson, midnight indigo, and muted, antique gold. These heavy rugs muffled his footsteps entirely, returning him to a state of absolute, reverent quiet. In the centre of the vast, cavernous space, a massive stone fireplace roared with a gentle, contained fury. Great thick logs of split cedarwood crackled and popped in the hearth, sending small, lazy showers of bright orange sparks dancing up into the dark, soot-blackened chimney. The scent in the air was intoxicating, rich, and deeply soothing to Elias's weary senses. It was the earthy, grounded perfume of burning cedarwood, intricately mingled with the sweet, honeyed aroma of melted beeswax candles that burned in iron sconces along the walls. Beneath that was the faint, dusty, magnificent tang of old parchment and leather, a smell that made the bookbinder's heart swell with quiet joy. And threading through it all was a spicy, incredibly welcoming undertone of brewing cinnamon and clove, suggesting that somewhere in this vast, quiet fortress, a kettle was singing over a fire. Elias slowly closed the heavy oak doors behind him. The sound of the heavy iron latch clicking softly shut acted as a final, definitive barrier between himself and the cold, swirling wilderness outside. He stood perfectly still for a long, quiet moment, simply breathing in the rich atmosphere. He let the profound warmth of the room penetrate his thick woolen coat, feeling it slowly thaw the lingering chill from his bones and seep into his tired muscles. He had been summoned to this remote place by a mysterious letter, a thick, cream-coloured envelope sealed with a heavy dollop of golden wax, inviting him to restore the castle's forgotten, sprawling library. There had been no mention of a master or a host, no specific instructions on who he was to meet upon his arrival. There was only the gentle written promise that warm quarters would be prepared for him, and that his quiet, meticulous labour would be deeply, genuinely appreciated. Removing his heavy coat and unwinding his maroon scarf, Elias draped them carefully over a sturdy, polished wooden bench near the roaring hearth, allowing the heat of the fire to dry the damp patches of melted snow. To his right, a wide, sweeping staircase of dark, polished mahogany led up to the private quarters of the castle. On the very bottom step, sitting perfectly centred, as if waiting just for his arrival, sat a small, polished brass lantern. Its single, stout beeswax candle burned with a remarkably steady, tear-shaped golden flame, casting a warm, inviting pool of light onto the rich, dark wood of the stairs. Elias picked it up, the metal handle feeling pleasantly warm against his bare palm, and began his slow, unhurried ascent into the upper reaches of the castle. The winding corridors above were just as impeccably kept and deeply comforting as the grand entrance hall. Fresh, fragrant boughs of pine were draped gracefully over the stone mantelpieces of smaller, dormant fireplaces along the hallway, their vibrant green needles providing a beautiful burst of life against the ancient grey stone. Softly glowing candles sat securely in wrought iron sconces every few paces, ensuring that no shadows grew too deep or too long in the corners. The silence up here was absolute and profound, insulated by the incredibly thick stone walls and the heavy, continuous snowfall outside. It was a silence that did not feel empty, but rather full of peace, like the quiet of a house where everyone is safely asleep. Elias found his assigned room at the very end of a particularly quiet, gently curving hallway. The heavy wooden door was pushed slightly ajar, offering a gentle, wordless invitation to step inside. He pushed it open the rest of the way and walked in, instantly letting out a long, contented sigh that seemed to carry away the last remnants of his travel fatigue. It was a true haven of comfort. A cheerful fire was already blazing merrily in a modest stone hearth, its bright flames casting dancing, flickering shadows across the smooth plaster walls. Drawn up wonderfully close to the warmth of the fire was an oversized, deeply cushioned armchair, upholstered in worn, incredibly soft forest green velvet. Beside the chair sat a small, round wooden table bearing a painted ceramic plate of thick, shortbread biscuits and a heavy iron kettle resting on an iron trivet, emitting a soft, wispy, continuous plume of fragrant steam. In the far corner of the cosy rooms stood a grand four-poster bed made of dark oak. It was piled delightfully high with thick, downy pillows and covered completely in a magnificent, overwhelmingly heavy quilt. The quilt was a masterpiece, woven in intricate, repeating patterns of midnight blue and silver thread that seemed to catch the firelight. Elias walked slowly over to the bed and pressed his hand gently into the mattress. He smiled at the soft, yielding depth of it. It promised a slumber deeper, warmer, and more restful than any he had known in a very long time. He set his glowing brass lantern down on the bedside table and carried his weathered leather satchel over to a sturdy oak desk situated beneath a tall, beautiful frosted window. With methodical, loving, and practiced care, he unfastened the tarnished brass buckles and began to lay out the delicate tools of his trade upon the smooth grain of the wood. Each object he pulled from the bag was an old, trusted friend. He carefully arranged his smooth bone folders, implements polished to a milky, beautiful sheen from countless years of smoothing out stubborn creases in thick cotton rag paper. He lined up his wooden spools of heavy waxed linen thread, the very thread he used to bind separated pages together with precise, enduring strength. He placed down his small glass jars of dried wheat paste, his fine bristled sweeping brushes, and a tight roll of supple, buttery soft calfskin leather that smelled of rich earth, old attics, and forgotten stories. Simply touching these familiar tools grounded Elias completely. They were the instruments of preservation, the humble means of saving precious memories and fading stories from the quiet, inevitable decay of time. He felt a gentle, warming thrill of anticipation at the thought of the ancient library that awaited him somewhere in the vast echoing wings of this welcoming castle. But he knew that the work could wait. For tonight, his only task, his only responsibility was to rest. He needed to acclimatize his body to the deep stillness of the mountain and to let the long, arduous journey wash completely away from his shoulders. Moving away from the desk, Elias walked over to the velvet armchair by the fire, sinking slowly down into the plush, yielding cushion. It embraced him perfectly, settling around him as if the chair had been molded to his very awe over countless quiet evenings. He reached out and carefully poured hot water from the heavy iron kettle into a sturdy, matching ceramic mug that had been thoughtfully prepared with a fragrant blend of black tea leaves, dried orange peels, and crushed cloves. He cupped the warm mug in both of his hands, letting the soothing, radiating heat seep deeply into his palms and fingertips. He sat in silence, simply watching the fragrant steam curl lazily upward, catching the golden, flickering light of the fire, before vanishing entirely into the warm air of the room. He took a slow, careful sip. The warm, beautifully spiced liquid traced a soothing, comforting path down his throat and into his stomach, warming him from the inside out. He leaned his head back against the soft velvet of the chair and looked toward the tall, arched window. The glass was thick and slightly warped with great age, distorting his view of the falling snow into a beautiful, fluid, abstract painting of swirling whites and deep, shadowy blues. The transition from twilight to true, deep night was slowly happening across the sky, a majestic, unhurried deepening of colours from pale grey to a rich, enveloping indigo. The world outside the glass was slipping into a profound, undisturbed slumber, safely insulated from the wind by millions of tiny crystalline flakes. As Elias sat there, entirely relaxed, feeling the very last traces of tension melting away into the plush velvet of the chair, he slowly became aware of a sound. It was not the familiar, comforting crackle of the cedar logs in his hearth, nor was it the faint, muffled whistling of the mountain wind pushing against the heavy window panes and Joe's motion. It was a vibration, a sensation that was almost more felt in his chest than heard by his ears at first. A deep, profoundly resonant, rhythmic humming. He paused, holding his warm mug halfway to his lips, turning his head just slightly toward the open room to listen more closely. The sound seemed to be emanating from the very stones of the castle themselves, echoing softly and gently down from the high, shadowy corridors somewhere far above his room. It maintained an incredibly slow, steady, mesmerizing cadence. A low rumble, followed by a long, peaceful pause, and then another deep rumble, followed by another pause. It sounded, quite distinctly and impossibly, exactly like the deep, contented purr of a giant, sleeping cat. There was absolutely nothing alarming or frightening about the low, vibrating sound. In fact, it possessed a deeply soothing, almost hypnotic frequency. It was a baritone lullaby that vibrated through the heavy wooden floorboards and resonated gently within Elias's ribcage. It felt wonderfully companionable, a warm, massive, living presence in a sprawling castle that had, until this very moment, felt entirely and beautifully empty. The slow, rhythmic sound spoke of deep, uninterrupted sleep, of heavy, warm contentment, and of a peaceful, gentle soul resting quietly somewhere nearby in the dark. Elias took another slow, appreciative sip of his spiced tea, a gentle, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth and crinkling the skin around his tired eyes. A soft, warm curiosity began to stir within his quiet heart. As he listened to the rhythmic hum, he wondered what magnificent, unseen creature could possibly produce such a comforting, resonant melody. He wondered what sort of quiet dreams it might be having, curled up in the forgotten, dusty heights of the northern castle while the snow fell endlessly outside. The fire in the hearth popped softly, the logs settling down into a thick, glowing bed of cherry-red embers that radiated a heavy, sleepy heat. Elias slowly set his ceramic mug down onto the small wooden table, resting his hands in his lap. He sat in the warm, dim light, simply listening to the rhythmic, soothing hum that filled the ancient stones around him. As his eyelids began to grow heavy, drooping with the pleasant weight of exhaustion and the promise of rest, he decided that when the bright morning came, or perhaps when he had rested just a little while longer in this perfect sanctuary, he would take up his brass lantern. He would walk quietly through the halls, and he would follow that beautiful, lulling sound deep into the quiet heart of the castle. For a long, peaceful stretch of time, Elias simply remained in the deep embrace of the oversized armchair, letting the profound stillness of the room wash over him like a warm, heavy tide. He did not fall into a deep slumber right away, but rather drifted in that beautiful floating space between waking and dreaming, where the mind is completely untethered from the worries of the world. The fire in the hearth had burned down from roaring logs to a thick, soft bed of cherry-red embers, radiating a sleepy, enveloping heat that seemed to seep directly into his bones. He listened to the steady, rhythmic sound of his own breathing, noticing how it had begun to naturally synchronize with the deep, lulling hum echoing from the mysterious corridors above. The hum was so incredibly comforting, a low, resonant vibration that felt less like a sound and more like a physical sensation of pure safety. As the minutes stretched into what might have been hours, Elias felt the last remaining knots of tension from his long winter journey slowly untie themselves. The quiet of the northern castle was not an empty, lonely silence, but rather a rich, full hush, insulated by the endlessly falling snow outside. He opened his tired eyes, looking around the dim, cozy quarters he had been given. The shadows in the corners of the room were soft and completely unthreatening, dancing gently whenever a particularly bright ember popped in the fireplace. A profound sense of gratitude filled his quiet heart. He was a man who had dedicated his entire life to the preservation of old, forgotten things, to the patient mending of torn pages and cracked leather bindings. To find himself here, in this ancient, perfectly preserved sanctuary, felt like coming home to a place he had never known. With a slow, deliberate movement, Elias finally pushed himself up from the soft cushions of the armchair, his muscles stretching with a lazy, comfortable ease. He decided that the mysteries of this beautiful castle were far too inviting to leave for the morning light. The night was young, the castle was deeply asleep, and the gentle, rhythmic humming was a siren song of comfort that he felt compelled to follow. He walked softly over to the small, sturdy oak table near the door, where a beautifully crafted brass lantern sat waiting. The metal was cool and solid beneath his fingertips, a grounding, heavy weight in his hand. He reached into a small pewter dish beside the lantern and retrieved a long, wooden match. The sharp, brief scratch of the match against the stone was the only sudden sound in the room, quickly followed by the soft, rushing hiss of the newborn flame. A tiny wisp of wood smoke curled upward, smelling pleasantly of cedar and sulphur, before the flame settled into a bright, steady teardrop. Elias lifted the glass chimney of the lantern and touched the fire to the thick, woven wick. The wick drank the flame eagerly, blooming instantly into a steady, buttery yellow glow. He lowered the glass, and the lantern cast a beautiful, amber halo of light around him, pushing back the shadows and painting the stone walls in warm golden hues. It was a gentle, protective light, the perfect companion for a quiet nighttime wander. Taking up the lantern by its curved brass handle, Elias stepped toward the heavy oak door of his room. He pressed down on the wrought iron latch, which moved with a smooth, well-oiled silence, and pulled the door inward. The air in the corridor outside was noticeably cooler than the heated sanctuary of his room, but it was not a bitter or biting cold. It was a crisp, refreshing coolness, like the air in an autumn forest just after the sun has set. He stepped out into the hallway, pulling the heavy door shut behind him until it clicked softly into place, sealing him into the vast, quiet expanse of the ancient fortress. The corridor stretched out before him, a long, elegant tunnel of stone and wood, illuminated gently by the warm pool of his lantern light. Elias looked down and saw that the cold flagstones of the floor were completely covered by a remarkably thick, plush runner rug. The rug was woven in deep, rich colours, forest greens, burgundy reds, and midnight blues, arranged in intricate, repeating patterns of leaves and vines that seemed to flow down the hallway like a quiet river. He took a step forward, and the soft, thick wool of the rug completely muffled the sound of his leather-soled shoes. His footsteps were entirely silent, allowing the deep, rhythmic hum from above to remain the only sound echoing through the space. As he began his slow, peaceful walk down the winding hall, Elias marvelled at the impeccable upkeep of the castle. Despite its ancient, weather-beaten exterior, the interior was not a forgotten ruin covered in dust and cobwebs. It was a home that was deeply, lovingly cared for. The stone walls, constructed of massive, irregularly shaped blocks, were perfectly smooth and dry to the touch, their surfaces polished by centuries of passing hands. He could smell the distinct, sweet aroma of melted beeswax and natural oils, a scent that spoke of endless hours spent polishing wood and tending to the quiet details of the fortress. Every few paces he passed a tall, arched alcove set into the stone wall. In each alcove sat a sturdy iron sconce, holding a thick, ivory-coloured pillar candle. The candles were lit, their flames perfectly still in the draught-free air, casting small, steady pools of honeyed light against the stone. Elias paused beside one of the alcoves, bringing his lantern close to observe the candle. He watched as a single drop of warm, liquid wax gathered at the rim of the candle, swelled, and then rolled lazily down the side, leaving a smooth, beautiful trail before hardening near the base. The scent of the burning beeswax was intoxicatingly sweet, like a field of summer flowers captured and preserved for the dead of winter. Moving further down the corridor, the rich sensory details of the castle continued to unfold around him. He noticed that the grand, carved stone mantelpieces, which were spaced evenly along the inner walls, had been carefully decorated for the winter season. Thick, vibrant boughs of fresh pine and fragrant spruce were draped elegantly over the stone ledges, their dark green needles contrasting beautifully with the pale grey of the castle walls. Elias reached out and gently brushed his fingers against one of the pine boughs. The needles were soft, flexible, and wonderfully alive, releasing a crisp, bracing scent of pine sap that mingled perfectly with the warm, dusty sweetness of the beeswax and the distant smell of wood smoke. The gentle magic of the castle seemed to weave itself into every tapestry that hung between the arched windows. These tapestries were massive, heavy things, stretching from the high timbered ceiling almost down to the floor, acting both as breathtaking art and as thick insulation against the winter chill. As Elias walked past them, the amber light of his lantern swept across the woven threads, momentarily bringing the ancient scenes to life. The tapestries did not depict scenes of great battles or royal conquests. Instead, they showed quiet, peaceful moments of folklore. He saw woven forests, bathed in silver moonlight, gentle deer drinking from mirrored lakes, and enormous, soft-furred creatures slumbering beneath the roots of ancient trees. The colours were muted and earthy, dyed from roots and berries long ago, and they gave the hallway an atmosphere of a sleepy, timeless dream. Elias felt a deep, resonant kinship with the artists who had created these tapestries. As a bookbinder, he understood the value of slow, meticulous work, the kind of work that requires endless patience and a quiet mind. He imagined the weavers sitting by a fire hundreds of years ago, passing the shuttle back and forth, slowly building a world of comfort, thread by thread. He felt that same sense of quiet dedication in every perfectly aligned stone of the castle, in every polished wooden door frame, and in the gentle, rhythmic hum that was guiding his steps. Eventually, the winding corridor opened up slightly, leading him past a series of magnificent, towering windows. The windows were deeply recessed into the thick stone walls, their glass composed of hundreds of small, diamond-shaped panes held together by dark strips of lead. Elias approached the glass, lifting his lantern slightly so he could see outside. The contrast between the interior and the exterior world was absolute and beautiful. Inside, he was enveloped in a golden, honeyed warmth, surrounded by soft rugs and the smell of pine. Outside, the world was cast in the deep, velvety blue of a pure winter night. He rested his free hand against the stone frame of the window, leaning in close to the glass. A thick, beautiful layer of frost had crept up the edges of the panes, forming intricate crystalline patterns that looked like delicate white ferns and soft, frozen feathers. Through the clear center of the glass, he could see the snow falling heavily through the dark sky. The flakes were massive, lazy things, drifting down with a slow, hypnotic grace, catching the faint moonlight as they tumbled toward the earth. The snow was piling up softly on the thick stone sills outside, creating a natural, sound-muffling blanket that wrapped the entire castle in a cocoon of absolute silence. The glass itself was freezing to the touch, radiating a gentle chill that Elias could feel on his cheeks. But the cold could not penetrate the thick walls of the fortress. It only served to make the warmth of the hallway feel that much more precious and comforting. He stood there for a long time, simply watching the endless descent of the snow, mesmerized by the quiet, unstoppable force of winter. The deep blue twilight outside was the perfect backdrop for the golden safety of the castle, a reminder that no matter how cold the world became, there were always places of refuge, places where fires burned bright and the air was thick with peace. Slowly, Elias turned away from the window and continued his journey. The rhythmic hum, which had been a distant, lulling companion since he first arrived, was now growing noticeably deeper and richer. It was no longer just a sound in his ears. It was a physical vibration that he could feel humming through the thick soles of his shoes and thrumming gently in the wooden panels of the walls. It sounded like the purr of an impossibly large, incredibly contented cat, a sound that spoke of a deep, unshakable happiness. Elias found his own breathing slowing down even further, his heartbeat matching the slow, steady rhythm of the hum. As he walked, a new, delightful scent began to weave its way through the air, layering itself over the pine and the beeswax. It was a scent that Elias knew better than any other in the world, a scent that made his heart swell with a profound, quiet joy. It was the rich, complex aroma of old paper, aged leather, dry ink, and binding glue. It was the smell of 1,000 forgotten stories, sleeping quietly on wooden shelves, waiting patiently for someone to turn their pages. The scent grew stronger with every step he took, guiding him forward as surely as the warm light of his lantern. The corridor eventually widened, opening up into a grand, sweeping foyer that felt both majestic and incredibly welcoming. The ceiling here soared upward into the darkness, supported by massive arches of dark, carved walnut. The woodwork was breathtaking, intricately carved with interlocking patterns of oak leaves, acorns, and twisting ivy, all polished to a soft satin gleam. The thick plush runner rug ended here, giving way to a beautiful floor of wide, honey-coloured wooden planks that creaked ever so softly beneath his weight, a friendly, familiar sound that added to the deeply domestic feeling of the space. At the far end of this beautiful foyer stood the source of the old paper scent, the source of the golden light, and the source of the lulling, rhythmic hum. It was a magnificent pair of grand double doors, standing twice as tall as Elias. They were constructed of solid dark wood, heavy and ancient, banded with strips of burnished brass that glowed softly in the lantern light. The door handles were thick, heavy rings of brass, beautifully cast in the shape of sleeping animals curled into themselves. The doors were not closed tight. They stood slightly ajar, leaving a narrow gap of perhaps a few inches between them. From this gap, a warm, inviting wedge of golden light spilled out onto the wooden floor of the foyer, cutting through the dimness of the hall. The light was rich and thick, practically glowing with the dust motes that danced lazily in the air. The rhythmic, purring hum was loudest here, rolling out from the gap in the doors in slow, comforting waves that washed over Elias, wrapping him in an invisible blanket of pure tranquility. Elias stood before the grand double doors of the ancient library, his brass lantern held softly by his side. He did not feel an ounce of fear or trepidation, only a deep, abiding curiosity and a profound sense of peace. He had followed the quiet call of the northern castle, through the warm halls and past the frosted windows, and he had finally arrived at the heart of the sanctuary. He took one final, slow breath of the sweet, paper-scented air, letting the profound stillness of the moment settle deeply into his soul. The journey through the sleeping castle had been a beautiful, gentle dream, and now, as he reached out a quiet hand to gently push open the heavy wooden door, he was ready to step into the wondrous, golden light that waited within. The heavy wooden door yielded beneath his hand with the softest, most drawn-out sigh, moving on its ancient iron hinges as smoothly as if it had been waiting for his arrival all these long, snowy years. As the door swung inward, the narrow wedge of golden light expanded across the wide planks of the foyer floor, stretching out like a welcoming carpet. Elias stepped across the threshold, his leather boots making practically no sound upon the polished floorboards. He lowered his brass lantern slightly, allowing the breathtaking expanse of the ancient library to wash over him in a wave of profound, magnificent stillness. It was a sanctuary built not of mere stone and wood, but of time, memory, and quiet reverence. The room was incredibly vast, stretching out beneath a sweeping, vaulted ceiling that lost itself in the warm shadows high above. Great, arching ribs of dark walnut supported the ceiling, echoing the structure of an overturned ship that had come to rest upon a peaceful shore. The walls, from the sturdy floorboards all the way up to the shadowed rafters, were completely covered in towering, impeccably crafted wooden bookshelves. There were tens of thousands of books, standing shoulder to shoulder in silent, patient rows. Their spines were a tapestry of muted, elegant colours, deep forest greens, rich burgundies, faded indigos, and the warm, earthy tones of aged brown calfskin. Many of the bindings were stamped with intricate gold leaf that caught the amber light of the room, winking like tiny, distant constellations in a galaxy of stories. Elias stood motionless for a long time, simply breathing in the atmosphere of the room. The scent here was a masterpiece of comforting aromas, a perfume that only centuries of careful preservation could create. It was the sweet, almost vanilla-like fragrance of old, aging paper mixed with the deep, grounding scent of cured leather bindings. Beneath that lay the sharp, clean aroma of beeswax polish that had been lovingly rubbed into the wooden shelves, and the ever-present, warm embrace of the cedarwood smoke drifting from the far end of the room. It was a smell that made Elias feel entirely at home, a smell that whispered of endless, slow evenings spent entirely lost within the pages of a good book. He began to walk forward, his pace slow and measured, unwilling to disrupt the delicate, heavy peace of the room. Every few steps, he paused to look around, letting his eyes trace the elegant lines of the library. Heavy rolling ladders, made of dark mahogany and brass, clung to rails that ran along the upper tiers of the shelves, waiting patiently to carry a curious reader into the higher altitudes of knowledge. In the centre of the vast room, several long reading tables, made of thick oak, rested upon massive, ornately carved legs. They were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the warm light of the room. Along the right side of the library, a series of towering, arched windows looked out into the winter night. The glass was thick and slightly warped with age, distorting the outside world into a beautiful, impressionistic painting of soft shapes and colours. Outside, the deep, heavy blue of the twilight hour had settled over the northern pines, and the snow continued to fall in massive, lazy flakes, piling softly against the window panes. The lower edges of the glass were coated in intricate, creeping patterns of white frost, like delicate ferns made of ice. The contrast between the cold, blue twilight outside and the thick, honey-coloured warmth of the library inside made the room feel even more protective, like a deeply fortified haven against the chill of the world. As Elias ventured deeper into the aisles of towering shelves, the rhythmic purring hum that had drawn him here grew steadily louder. It was a deep, resonant sound, practically vibrating through the floorboards and rising through the soles of his boots. It was the sound of utter, unshakable contentment. Elias followed the sound, navigating the labyrinth of bookshelves with a quiet, joyful anticipation. He turned a corner past a section of exceptionally large, leather-bound atlases, and finally emerged into a wide, open clearing at the very back of the library. Here, the architecture of the room opened up to accommodate a truly massive stone fireplace. The hearth was easily large enough for a man to stand inside, built from enormous blocks of smooth, dark river stone. Inside the grate, a magnificent cedarwood fire was burning steadily. It was not a chaotic, roaring blaze, but a deeply established, mature fire. Thick, white-hot logs were broken down into a bed of glowing ruby-red embers that pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, radiating a blanket of intense, comforting heat into the room. Above the mantel, more fresh pine boughs had been arranged, filling this end of the library with the clean, crisp scent of the winter forest. And there, standing before one of the lower shelves near the hearth, was the source of the wonderful, rhythmic humming. Elias stopped, his breath catching softly in his throat, though not out of fear. It was a breathless sense of pure, innocent wonder. Before him stood a beast of magnificent, gentle proportions. He was massive, easily twice the height and width of a large bear, but there was nothing fearsome about his silhouette. He was covered from head to toe in an incredibly thick, luxurious coat of fur. The colour of his fur was breathtaking, a perfect reflection of the twilight sky outside the frosted windows. It was a shifting blend of soft slate grey, deep, calming indigo, and the muted silver of a winter moon. The fur looked so incredibly soft and dense that it seemed to absorb the firelight, glowing with a faint, warm halo. Wrapped thickly around the beast's massive neck was an oversized knitted scarf. It was a beautiful, slightly clumsy creation of incredibly chunky wool, woven in thick stripes of mustard, yellow, and deep forest green. One long end of the scarf draped over the beast's broad shoulder, falling almost to the floor. The scarf gave the magnificent creature an air of endearing, domestic coziness, completely dispelling any lingering notion that he might be a wild thing. The beast, whom Elias would soon come to know as Bram, was entirely absorbed in his work. He held a large, wonderfully fluffy feather duster in one of his massive, padded paws. With agonizingly slow, incredibly delicate movements, he was sweeping the soft feathers over the spines of the books on the lower shelf, clearing away dust motes that had not yet settled. Despite his enormous size, his movements were graceful, precise, and filled with an undeniable tenderness. He cared for these books. He was their guardian. Elias stood quietly, watching the gentle giant work, the brass lantern hanging motionless from his hand. He did not want to startle the creature, so he simply waited, letting his presence settle into the room. For a long few minutes, the only sounds were the crackle of the cedar logs, the soft, brushing sound of the feather duster, and the deep, rumbling purr that emanated from deep within Bram's broad chest. Eventually, Bram paused. The large, tufted ears atop his head twitched slightly, swiveling toward the aisle where Elias stood. Slowly, unhurriedly, the great beast turned his head. Elias found himself looking into a face that was both incredibly ancient and beautifully gentle. Bram had a broad, noble snout covered in soft, silver-tipped fur, and long, sweeping whiskers that twitched slightly as he sniffed the air. But it was his eyes that truly captivated the bookbinder. They were large, liquid, and entirely peaceful. They were the rich, warm colour of polished amber, or a cup of strongly brewed tea, catching the light of the fire and reflecting it back with a deep, soulful intelligence. There was no alarm in those magnificent eyes, no sudden widening of surprise or defensive posturing. Bram simply looked at Elias, taking in the sight of the small, quiet man holding the lantern. Elias offered a soft, deeply respectful bow of his head, a silent greeting from one gentle soul to another. The beast blinked. It was a long, incredibly slow blink, the kind of heavy-lidded gesture a contented cat gives to someone it entirely trusts. The deep, rhythmic purring in Bram's chest, which had paused for a brief moment, resumed, growing even richer and warmer than before. He lowered the feather duster, placing it carefully upon a nearby wooden cart, and turned his massive body fully toward Elias. With a slow, sweeping motion of his large paw, Bram gestured toward the space in front of the grand fireplace. Arranged upon an enormous circular hearth rug woven from thick braids of red and gold wool sat 2 armchairs. They were comically different in size. One was a generously proportioned, deeply cushioned armchair upholstered in worn, crimson velvet, perfectly sized for a human. The other was a truly colossal piece of furniture, a sprawling, nest-like chair built of thick oak and covered in mountains of heavy woolen blankets and soft sheepskin throws. It was clearly Bram's favoured resting place. Bram took a few heavy, padded steps toward the fire, his footfalls completely silent on the thick rugs. He stopped beside the hearth and turned his massive head back to Elias, offering a single, slow nod. It was an unmistakable invitation. Welcome to the fire. Welcome to the quiet. Elias felt a profound smile tug at the corners of his mouth. He walked forward, stepping out of the shadowed aisles and into the radiant warmth of the fireside. He set his brass lantern down on a low wooden side table near the crimson armchair. The heat from the glowing cedar logs washed over him immediately, sinking through his woolen trousers and heavy sweater, beginning to melt away the deep, lingering chill of his long journey through the snowy northern pines. As Elias approached the crimson armchair, he noticed a heavy, black cast-iron kettle suspended over the fire on a sturdy iron hook. A tiny, wispy plume of steam was just beginning to escape from the spout, accompanied by a very soft, melodic whistling sound that harmonized beautifully with the crackle of the sap in the logs. Bram settled his massive frame onto the braided rug, remaining on his feet but lowering his center of gravity. With surprising dexterity, the gentle beast reached out with 2 large claws and carefully lifted the heavy iron kettle from its hook. He moved it away from the flames, his thick fur insulating him perfectly from the intense heat. On the hearthstone rested a large wooden tray carrying a simple stoneware teapot and 2 mismatched mugs. One was a standard, sturdy ceramic mug, glazed in a deep, mottled blue. The other was an enormous, wide-brimmed bowl that resembled a small soup tureen, perfectly suited for a beast of Bram's dimensions. With a practiced, completely steady hand, Bram poured the boiling water into the stoneware teapot. The sound of the water cascading into the pot was a gentle, rushing melody in the quiet room. Instantly, a thick cloud of fragrant steam rose into the air, and the scent of the tea began to fill the space around the hearth. It was an incredibly complex, deeply warming aroma. Elias could immediately detect the spicy, sharp sweetness of cinnamon bark and whole cloves, the earthy warmth of fresh ginger, the distinct, licorice-like note of star anise, and beneath it all, the sweet, heavy scent of raw honey. It was a fragrance designed to soothe tired bones and warm the spirit from the inside out. Bram replaced the lid on the teapot and set the kettle back on its hook. He then gently pushed the wooden tray closer to Elias's crimson armchair, sliding it smoothly across the polished stone of the hearth. The beast then backed away, finally lowering his enormous body into his colossal blanket-lined chair. He curled his legs beneath him, wrapping his thick, twilight-coloured tail around his paws, and let out a long, heavy sigh that fluttered the fringes of his oversized knitted scarf. Elias sat down slowly in the crimson velvet armchair. The cushions were incredibly soft, having been worn into a state of perfect, yielding comfort over many decades. He sank into the chair, feeling the velvet embrace him like a warm hug. He leaned forward, reaching out to the wooden tray. The teapot was hot to the touch, radiating a comforting heat against his fingertips. He carefully lifted the pot and poured the dark, rich, amber-coloured tea into his blue ceramic mug. He set the teapot down and wrapped both of his hands around the warm mug. Lifting it close to his face, he closed his eyes, inhaling the rising steam deeply. The scent of the spices and the honey filled his senses, bringing with it a rush of absolute peace. He took a small, careful sip, The tea was incredibly delicious, perfectly brewed and sweetened, just the right amount. The warmth travelled down his throat and settled in his chest, a glowing ember of comfort that matched the fire burning brightly on the hearth. He opened his eyes and looked across the hearth at Bram. The gentle beast had poured his own tea into the massive bowl and was quietly lapping at it, his eyes half closed in utter contentment. The rhythmic purring had returned to a soft background rumble, a steady heartbeat for the ancient room. Elias looked away from the beast and let his gaze wander up the towering walls of the library. He looked at the tens of thousands of books, many of them showing the wear and tear of centuries. He saw the cracked leather bindings, the loose pages, the faded gold leaf. He had been invited to the northern castle to practice his trade, to repair and bind these forgotten volumes. It was a solitary, quiet task, one that he had always loved. But as he sat there, feeling the deep, heavy silence of the snowy night outside and the comforting warmth of the fire inside, a quiet realization began to bloom within his mind. He looked back at Bram, observing the way the beast watched the dancing flames, a gentle, melancholy stillness resting upon his massive shoulders. Bram was a guardian, yes. He kept the dust away and tended the fires. But a library is only truly alive when its books are read. Elias understood now, with a clarity that brought a profound sense of purpose to his heart. His task in this sanctuary was not merely to apply glue to cracked spines or to stitch loose pages back together. His task was to repair the vessels so that the stories within them could be set free. He was here to bring the voices of the past back to life, to fill the deep, beautiful silence of this room with the cadence of classical tales. He was here to share the gentle magic of reading with a lonely, twilight-coloured beast who had waited patiently by the fire for countless winter evenings. Elias took another slow sip of his spiced tea, feeling a deep, relaxing heaviness beginning to settle into his limbs. The journey to the castle was over. The mystery of the purring hum had been beautifully solved, and the long, slow work of the winter was about to begin. He sank a little deeper into the crimson velvet of the armchair, resting his head against the high back. He watched the glowing red embers of the cedar logs, listened to the muffled hush of the snow falling against the frosted glass, and simply allowed himself to exist in this perfect, unbroken sanctuary of warmth and quiet. The evening stretched out before them, an unhurried, peaceful expanse of time, waiting to be filled with the soft rustle of ancient paper and the gentle rhythm of a story well told. Elias allowed the profound stillness of the room to settle over him for a few moments longer, savouring the feeling of the heavy crimson velvet against his shoulders and the radiating warmth of the cedar logs. He felt no rush, no pressing urgency to begin. The northern castle existed entirely outside the frantic, breathless pace of the modern world he had left behind in the valleys below. Here, time was not measured by the ticking of a clock or the shortening of shadows, but by the slow, even breaths of the gentle beast beside him and the steady, mesmerizing dance of the flames. When he finally felt entirely grounded, entirely at peace with the quiet evening, Elias gently set his ceramic mug upon a small, sturdy oak side table. The soft clink of the earthenware against the polished wood was a grounding, comfortable sound, ringing out like a tiny, gentle bell in the vast, muffled quiet of the great library. He rose from the armchair with a slow, deliberate grace, smoothing the wrinkles from his woolen trousers. The firelight played across the folds of his clothes, painting them in shifting shades of amber and gold. Beside him, Bram lifted his massive, twilight-coloured head, his large, deeply expressive eyes following Elias's movements with a calm, trusting curiosity. The deep, rhythmic purr that rumbled within the beast's broad chest did not cease. Rather, it seemed to shift into a slightly higher, more inquisitive register, a soft, vibrating hum that vibrated gently through the thick soles of Elias's leather boots. Elias offered the giant creature a warm, reassuring smile, reaching out a hand to gently pat the air in a calming gesture before making his way toward his sturdy leather satchel, which rested near the heavy double doors. The satchel was a companion of many years, worn soft and pliable by countless journeys. As Elias unbuckled the brass clasps, the familiar, comforting scent of his trade drifted up to greet him, a rich, earthy aroma of natural beeswax, aged linen thread, dried wheat paste, and supple binding leather. He carried the bag to a large, flat-topped mahogany table that sat just at the edge of the fire's golden halo. The table was vast and solid, its surface smoothed by centuries of quiet study, making it the perfect workstation for his gentle craft. Slowly, methodically, Elias began to unpack his tools, laying them out upon the wood with the careful reverence of a musician preparing their instrument. First came a heavy canvas roll, which he untied and unfurled with a soft, satisfying swish. Tucked neatly within its pockets were his implements, a polished bone folder, its smooth, curved surface glowing like ivory in the firelight, a set of natural bristle brushes, their handles worn to the exact shape of his grip, a small, brass-capped awl, and several spools of thick, cream-coloured linen thread. Next, he retrieved a small, glass jar of pure beeswax and a tin of specialised binding paste, the ingredients of which he had mixed himself in his quiet cottage far away. Every movement Elias made was unhurried, measured, and rhythmic, contributing to the hypnotic, lulling atmosphere of the library. When his workstation was prepared, Elias walked slowly toward one of the lower shelves, where Bram had earlier been dusting with his oversized, gentle paw. He ran his fingertips lightly across the spines of the forgotten volumes. They were dry, fragile things, starved of touch and attention. He closed his eyes for a moment, relying purely on the tactile sensation, feeling the cracked leather and the raised ridges of the bindings. His fingers paused over a particularly thick volume bound in faded, forest green leather. The spine was heavily creased, and the front cover hung loosely, clinging to the text block by only a few fragile threads. Elias carefully withdrew the book from the shelf, cradling it in both hands as if it were a delicate, sleeping bird. He carried the injured book back to the mahogany table, the soft scuff of his boots against the woven rugs, the only sound aside from Bram's continuous, resonant purr. Sitting down on a sturdy wooden stool, Elias placed the book beneath the warm glow of a nearby brass lantern. He opened the cover with infinite care, a soft, dry crackle whispering through the air as the aged paper was exposed to the light. The pages were thick, handmade parchment, yellowed at the edges like autumn leaves, and filled with elegant, swirling calligraphy. It was a collection of ancient folklore, tales of sleepy forests, wandering rivers, and quiet twilight magic. Elias smiled softly. It was the perfect story for a winter's night. He began the restoration process, a series of motions so practiced and fluid they felt like a quiet meditation. First, he took a soft, wide-bristled brush and gently swept away the decades of accumulated dust from the gutters of the pages. The brush made a soothing, rhythmic shh sound as it glided over the paper, a repetitive, whispering cadence that seemed to deepen the silence of the room. Bram shifted his massive bulk, turning his body toward the table. The beast tucked his enormous paws beneath his chest, resting his heavy chin upon them, and watched Elias with unblinking, heavy-lidded fascination. The gentle creature was completely captivated by the slow, purposeful movements of the bookbinder. Next, Elias opened his tin of binding paste. The scent that rose from it was mild and earthy, a subtle aroma of wheat and rain-dampened earth that mingled perfectly with the sharp, clean smell of the burning cedarwood. Using a smaller, stiffer brush, he applied a thin, even layer of the paste along the exposed, frayed edge of the text block where the cover had detached. He worked with absolute patience, ensuring the glue was spread perfectly. his hand steady and graceful. Once the paste was applied, he gently aligned the heavy green leather cover, pressing it back into its rightful place. To secure the bond, Elias took up his polished bone folder. He pressed the smooth, curved edge against the leather hinge, running it firmly but gently up and down the crease. The bone folder glided over the leather with a soft, frictionless glide, a deeply satisfying, tactile motion that smoothed out the wrinkles and pressed the fibers firmly together. Up and down, he worked the tool, the rhythmic motion lulling and hypnotic. He then took a small, clean cotton cloth, dabbed it lightly into his jar of beeswax, and began to polish the newly secured leather. The wax warmed beneath the friction of his hand, releasing a sweet, honeyed fragrance into the air that wrapped around the two occupants of the library, like a heavy, invisible quilt. As he rubbed the wax into the dry, thirsty cover in slow, overlapping circles, the dull, faded green began to deepen, reviving into a rich, lustrous emerald. The intricate gold tooling on the cover, previously obscured by age and grime, caught the light of the lantern and sparkled with a renewed, quiet dignity. Elias worked in a state of flow, completely lost in the simple, beautiful act of mending. He did not rush. He let the quiet minutes stretch into a long, peaceful hour. Enveloped in the warmth of the fire, the hush of the falling snow outside, and the deep, comforting vibrations of Bram's endless purr. Finally, the work was complete. Elias set down his polishing cloth and gently ran his bare hand over the revitalized cover. It felt solid, supple, and whole again. He let out a long, quiet sigh of profound satisfaction. He picked up the heavy volume, feeling its reassuring weight, and stood up from the mahogany table. The castle felt deeply still, wrapped in the protective embrace of the winter night, the snow piling silently against the thick, leaded glass of the high windows, sealing them away in their own private world of warmth and safety. Elias walked slowly back toward the grand fireplace, where the twin velvet armchairs awaited. Bram lifted his head slightly as Elias approached, his massive, tufted ears twitching with quiet anticipation. The beast's scarf, beautifully knitted and oversized, shifted slightly around his thick neck, looking incredibly warm and soft. Elias sank back into his armchair, feeling the plush velvet yield instantly to his weight. He rested the heavy, green book upon his lap, letting his hands rest flat against the cool, smooth leather for a moment of quiet respect. "Well, my friend," Elias said, his voice a low, warm rumble that blended effortlessly with the crackle of the hearth. He spoke softly, not wishing to shatter the delicate tranquility of the room. "The vessel is mended. It is time to see what memories it holds within." Bram let out a soft, breathy huff that sounded remarkably like a contented sigh. The giant beast shifted closer, his massive, twilight-coloured body stretching out fully across the thick, woven rug that lay before the fire. He rested his heavy head sideways on his front paws, his large, dark eyes fixed directly upon the book in Elias's lap. The purr in his chest grew deeper, a steady, rhythmic thrumming that felt like a soothing heartbeat echoing through the ancient stone floor. Elias gently opened the book. The spine, newly reinforced and supple, gave way with a soft, yielding creak. He turned to the first page, the thick parchment thick and heavy beneath his fingers. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the fragrant air of the library fill his lungs, and began to read. His voice was a steady, melodic baritone, perfectly suited for the quiet evening. He read with a slow, measured cadence, pausing at the end of each sentence, allowing the words to hang in the warm air before fading away. He read a story about a quiet, meandering river that flowed through an ancient, slumbering forest. He described how the water babbled gently over smooth, moss-covered stones, how the silver light of the moon reflected upon its glassy surface, and how the ancient willow trees bowed their heavy branches to brush against the cool current. He spoke of the deep, velvety silence of the woods at midnight, where the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves and the gentle, eternal song of the flowing water. As Elias's voice filled the room, carrying the story into the quiet corners of the vast library, something incredibly beautiful began to happen. It did not happen all at once, nor was it startling in any way. It began as a subtle, soft phenomenon, a gentle manifestation of the castle's ancient, benevolent magic. From the surface of the yellowed pages resting in Elias's lap, a single, tiny mote of golden light detached itself from the black ink. It was the colour of a glowing ember, soft and warm, and it floated upward, drifting lazily into the air like a tiny, weightless firefly. Then, another mote drifted upward, and another, until a slow, steady stream of golden, illuminated dust was rising gracefully from the open book. Elias paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes widening slightly in quiet wonder, but he did not stop reading. He instinctively understood that the magic was fueled by the cadence of the story, by the act of sharing the forgotten words. He continued to speak, his voice growing even softer, even more reverent, as the stream of golden light thickened, rising up toward the high, vaulted ceiling. The floating lights began to gather and weave together in the warm air directly above the hearth, just out of reach of the dancing flames. They moved with a slow, liquid grace, swirling and shifting like smoke, before slowly coalescing into faint, beautiful, translucent shapes. Right there, in the middle of the library, the story was coming to life in a projection of pure, gentle light. Elias watched in awe as the golden motes formed the sweeping, drooping branches of an enormous willow tree, its illuminated leaves swaying softly in an invisible breeze. Beneath the tree, a shimmering ribbon of light flowed steadily, mimicking the gentle current of the river he was describing. Tiny, sparkling pinpricks of light drifted down from the illusory branches, like falling leaves coming to rest upon the glowing water. The entire vision was bathed in a soft, honeyed amber glow, casting a warm, moving tapestry of light and shadow across the stone walls and the rows of leather-bound books. The magic was completely silent, a visual symphony that perfectly complemented the soothing rumble of Elias's voice and the crackle of the fire. The projections were not solid. They were ethereal and gossamer, shimmering like a mirage on a warm summer evening. As Elias read about a small wooden boat drifting lazily down the river, the golden lights shifted and reformed, creating the delicate outline of a little skiff bobbing gently on the illuminated current, turning slowly beneath the imaginary moonlight. Elias glanced down at Bram. The giant, gentle beast was utterly transfixed. His massive head remained resting upon his paws, but his large, dark eyes were wide, reflecting the golden, swirling lights above him. The reflection made his eyes look like twin pools of warm honey. Bram's purr had slowed, deepening into a heavy, resonant hum of absolute, unadulterated contentment. He watched the glowing willow tree and the drifting boat with the pure, innocent wonder of a creature who had waited centuries for a story to be told. There was no fear in the beast, only a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The loneliness that had long haunted the empty halls of the northern castle was dissolving, melting away like frost beneath a gentle morning sun. The air in the library felt heavy and thick, saturated with comfort, warmth, and the sleepy, lulling magic of the illuminated words. Elias's voice flowed on, a steady, unbroken stream of calm. He read about how the river finally reached a vast, still lake, a place of ultimate rest, where the waters ceased their flowing and simply settled into a deep, mirroring calm. As he described the absolute stillness of the lake, the golden lights above the hearth began to slow their swirling dance. The shimmering river widened, smoothing out into a broad, flat expanse of softly glowing light that hovered peacefully in the warm air, perfectly still, perfectly tranquil. Bram let out a long, shuddering sigh of happiness, a massive breath that ruffled the fringe of his oversized knitted scarf. The gentle beast's heavy eyelids began to droop, blinking slowly, fighting a losing battle against the profound, comforting weight of sleep. He shifted his massive body, curling slightly tighter into a giant, furry ball upon the rug. He tucked his nose beneath his thick tail, sighing once more as the radiant heat from the fire washed over his back. Elias felt his own eyelids growing heavy, influenced by the hypnotic, swaying magic of the lights and the deep, rhythmic breathing of the beast beside him. His body felt warm, completely relaxed, sinking ever deeper into the embrace of the velvet armchair. The tension of his long journey, the cold of the winter night, all of it had vanished entirely, replaced by a deep, beautiful lethargy. He turned the final page of the book, his movements slow and dreamlike, the heavy parchment settling softly against its brethren. He spoke the final words of the story, his voice fading to a gentle, resonant whisper that seemed to linger in the air long after he closed his mouth. As the last syllable left his lips, the vast illuminated lake above the hearth gave her a final, soft shimmer. The golden motes did not vanish abruptly. Instead, they began to drift downward, falling as slowly and softly as the snow outside the window. They drifted down like glowing, weightless embers, settling upon the floor, upon the arms of Elias's chair, and upon the thick, twilight-coloured fur of the sleeping beast, before slowly fading away into nothingness, leaving only a lingering feeling of perfect warmth. Elias closed the restored green cover of the book, letting his hands rest upon it. The magic had receded, but the profound peace it had left behind was palpable, a heavy, comforting blanket draped over the entire room. He looked at Bram. The gentle guardian of the library had finally succumbed to the soothing power of the tale. The beast's chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic cadence, his deep, rumbling purr replaced by the soft, even sound of a deep and peaceful slumber. The massive creature looked impossibly comfortable, a mountain of soft fur bathed in the red glow of the dying fire. Elias did not move to stand right away. He simply sat in the quiet aftermath of the magic, listened to the gentle hiss and pop of the cedar logs and the muffled eternal hush of the winter snow banking against the frosted glass of the high windows. The library was no longer a silent, lonely tomb of forgotten words. It was a warm, living sanctuary, a place where stories could breathe, where magic was gentle, and where rest was freely given. Elias let his head lean back against the velvet, taking a long, deep breath of the beeswax and wood smoke, feeling a deep, profound readiness for his own restful sleep slowly wash over him. Elias sat in the hushed stillness for a long, immeasurable time, allowing the profound tranquility of the ancient library to settle deeply into his own bones. There was no rush to move, no urgent task calling him away, no pressing demand upon his time or his spirit. He simply existed in the quiet aftermath of the gentle magic, a willing captive to the heavy, comforting peace that had descended upon the room. The grand fireplace, which had roared with cheerful vigour earlier in the evening, had slowly quieted its boisterous dance. The flames had settled down into a beautiful, pulsing landscape of ruby and gold embers, a miniature kingdom of glowing warmth that radiated softly outward, holding the chill of the northern winter firmly at bay. The soft popping of the cedar logs had faded into a gentle, rhythmic hissing, like the quiet breathing of the fire itself, slowly preparing for its own long slumber. Beside the hearth, Bram, the massive and gentle guardian of the northern castle, slept the deep, unbroken sleep of a creature entirely at peace. The great beast was curled into a loose, comfortable crescent upon the thick woven hearth rug, his enormous paws tucked neatly beneath his chin, his thick, twilight-coloured fur rising and falling in a slow, steady cadence. The beautifully oversized, hand-knitted scarf he wore was draped softly across his broad shoulders, rising and falling with every deep breath. From deep within his massive chest came a sound that was less of a snore and more of a subterranean purr, a low, rumbling vibration that resonated through the heavy stone floorboards and up through the legs of Elias's velvet armchair. It was a sound of absolute contentment, a deeply soothing rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the beating of Elias's own heart, slowing his pulse, relaxing his shoulders, and drawing the tension from his tired muscles like water flowing gently downhill. Elias watched the sleeping guardian for a while longer, a soft, fond smile touching the corners of his mouth. The task he had been given, to restore the forgotten library of this secluded fortress, had seemed daunting at first, a monumental undertaking of leather, glue, and endless, dusty pages. But now, seeing the profound effect that a single beautifully restored story could have upon this lonely, gentle soul, Elias understood the true nature of his work. He was not merely mending broken bindings. He was tending to the heartbeat of the castle itself, reawakening its memories, and offering companionship to a creature whose entire existence was defined by his quiet, patient loyalty. It was good work. It was meaningful work. And as the realization settled warmly in his chest, Elias felt a deep, satisfying weariness wash over him, a physical readiness for rest that he had not felt in many long years. Moving with deliberate slowness so as not to disturb the peaceful atmosphere, Elias gently pushed himself up from the deep plush embrace of the velvet armchair. His joints gave a faint, quiet pop. Settling into a relaxed posture as he stood, he reached down and picked up the freshly restored volume, his fingers tracing the smooth, expertly oiled green leather of the cover one last time. The faint, clean scent of the natural binding glue and the rich, honeyed aroma of the beeswax polish mingled in the air around him, a testament to a job done with care and reverence. He walked softly over to a sturdy oak reading stand situated near the edge of the firelight and laid the book down, centering it perfectly, a silent promise that its stories were safe, preserved, and ready to be shared again when the time was right. He turned back toward the hearth, looking down at the slumbering giant. Bram let out a long, shuddering sigh in his sleep, his ears twitching slightly, perhaps dreaming of the golden, floating lights that had danced through the air just moments before. "Good night, my gentle friend," Elias whispered, his voice barely more than a soft breath, blending seamlessly with the quiet hiss of the dying embers. "Sleep well. The stories will be here for you tomorrow." Elias turned and walked toward the heavy oak table where he had left his brass lantern. The metal was cool to the touch as he picked it by the curved handle. He struck a long wooden match against the stone side of the fireplace, the sudden flare of light casting a brief, dancing shadow against the tall bookshelves. He touched the flame to the lantern's braided wick, watching as it caught and blossomed into a steady, warm amber glow. He lowered the glass chimney, enclosing the flame, and the light instantly softened, painting the immediate surroundings in rich, honeyed tones. With his lantern in hand, Elias made his way toward the grand double doors of the library. His footsteps were completely muffled by the thick, ancient rugs that covered the stone floor, his movements slow and fluid, as if the very air in the room had thickened, pressing gently against him, encouraging him to slow down, to breathe deeply, to let go of the day. He reached the doors, slipping through the small gap he had left open earlier, and pulled them shut behind him. The heavy oak settled into its frame with a soft, resonant thud, a deeply satisfying sound of closure, sealing the warmth and the sleeping guardian safely inside. The corridor beyond the library was cooler, the air holding a crisp, refreshing stillness that contrasted beautifully with the sleepy, heavy warmth of the room he had just left. The absolute silence of the northern castle stretched out before him, a vast, echoing quiet that was not empty, but rather filled with a profound, watchful peace. The thick stone walls of the fortress, built centuries ago to withstand the howling gales of the northern winters, now served to insulate the interior, wrapping the corridors in a blanket of total hush. Elias held his lantern a little higher, the amber light pushing back the velvety shadows, revealing the rich, woven tapestries that lined the walls. As he walked, his soft leather-soled shoes, making no sound upon the long, woven runner that stretched down the centre of the hall, he studied the tapestries. In the flickering light of his lantern, the woven figures, kings in quiet contemplation, mythical beasts resting beneath ancient trees, and gentle maidens tending to blooming gardens, seemed to slumber in the woven threads, their embroidered eyes closed in perpetual, peaceful rest. The scent of the fresh pine boughs, draped lovingly over the stone sconces by Bram's careful paws earlier in the week, filled the corridor, a clean, crisp aroma that mingled beautifully with the lingering scent of old parchment and wood smoke clinging to Elias's clothes. He moved at a leisurely, unhurried pace, letting the rhythm of his own footsteps lull his mind into an even deeper state of relaxation. He passed beneath grand, sweeping archways, the architecture of the castle gently guiding him toward the wing where his private quarters awaited. Halfway down the longest corridor, Elias paused beside one of the tall, narrow windows that punctuated the thick stone wall. The glass was thick and slightly rippled, bordered by intricate patterns of frost that crept inward from the leaded frames like delicate silver ferns. Elias stepped closer, holding his hand up to shield the reflection of his lantern, and looked out into the night. Beyond the frost, the world was a mesmerizing canvas of deep indigo and pure, brilliant white. The snow was falling with a heavy, hypnotic grace, immense, feathery flakes tumbling endlessly out of the dark sky, swirling and dancing in the faint, silvery light of the hidden moon. The wind had died down completely, leaving the snowfall to descend in absolute, perfect silence. The thick pine trees that surrounded the fortress were bowed under the weight of the snow, their branches drooping like sleepy giants, completely blanketed in soft, pristine white. Standing there, looking out at the frozen, beautiful world, Elias felt a profound sense of isolation, but it was not a lonely isolation. It was the deeply comforting isolation of being completely separated from the rush and noise of the world, securely tucked away within the impregnable walls of an ancient sanctuary. The fierce, biting cold of the northern winter was just inches away, pressed against the other side of the glass, but inside, Elias was warm, safe, and entirely protected. The contrast made the warmth of his lantern and the soft wool of his sweater feel incredibly precious, a luxurious comfort that he savoured with a long, slow exhale. He watched the falling snow for a few moments longer, letting the rhythmic, endless descent of the flakes quiet the last lingering thoughts in his mind, before turning back to the corridor and continuing his gentle journey. At the end of the hall, he reached the heavy oak door that led to his assigned quarters. He pressed his thumb against the smooth, worn iron latch, which lifted with a quiet, satisfying click. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, instantly enveloped in a wave of perfectly curated warmth. During his time in the library, someone, or perhaps the subtle, attentive magic of the castle itself, had tended to his room. A fire burned brightly in the wide stone hearth, the logs arranged perfectly to provide a steady, crackling heat that had baked into the stone walls and warmed the heavy wooden floorboards. Elias closed the door behind him, the thick wood sealing out the cooler air of the corridor, and leaving him alone in his private, cosy haven. He set his brass lantern down on a sturdy side table, the amber glow mingling with the cheerful, dancing light of the fire. The room smelled heavenly, a deeply relaxing blend of the burning cedar wood, a faint trace of dried lavender that hung in small, neatly tied bundles near the window, and the clean, crisp scent of fresh linens. He moved slowly to the hearth, sitting down on a small wooden stool to begin the quiet, comforting ritual of ending the day. He reached down and unlaced his sturdy leather boots, pulling them off one by one and setting them neatly aside. The simple act of freeing his feet brought a wave of immediate relief, a physical untying of the day's journey. He wiggled his toes in his thick woolen socks, feeling the radiant heat of the fire soaking instantly into his skin. He stood and unbuttoned his heavy overcoat, draping it carefully over the back of a wooden chair, followed by his vest and his suspenders. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and deeply domestic, a shedding of the day's responsibilities, layer by layer. From a beautiful polished wooden wardrobe, Elias withdrew his nightclothes, a long, soft shirt of thick, brushed flannel that felt incredibly soft against his skin. He changed into the nightshirt, the fabric retaining a faint, comforting chill that was quickly chased away by the ambient heat of the room. He stepped over to a small washstand in the corner, where a heavy, white porcelain pitcher sat within a matching basin. He lifted the pitcher, pouring a steady stream of water into the basin. The water had been left near the fire and was perfectly, wonderfully warm. He cupped his hands, splashing the soothing water over his face, washing away the fine dust of the old library books and the last traces of wakefulness. He reached for a thick, impossibly soft cotton towel, pressing it gently against his skin, savouring the rough soft texture and the clean smell of soap. Now fully prepared for rest, Elias turned his attention to the bed. It was a masterpiece of comfort, dominating the corner of the room, built high off the floor on a frame of dark, carved walnut. He walked over to it, pulling back the thick, heavy layers of bedding. Beneath a beautifully woven woolen quilt of deep, forest green lay a thick layer of down, followed by crisp, white linen sheets that looked as smooth as undisturbed snow. The mattress itself was a deep, luxurious featherbed, rising high and inviting in the firelight. Elias walked back to the side table. He leaned over his brass lantern, pursed his lips, and blew a soft, gentle stream of air over the glass chimney. The flame fluttered, danced for a brief second, and then vanished, leaving a thin, curling ribbon of white smoke that quickly dissipated into the warm air. With the lantern extinguished, the room was bathed solely in the soft, fluctuating, reddish-gold light of the dying fire, creating long, slow-moving shadows that stretched across the ceiling like a gentle, rocking canopy. He stepped up to the bed, climbing in and sinking deeply into the center of the feather mattress. The mattress seemed to sigh as it accepted his weight, rising up around his sides to cradle him perfectly. Elias reached down and grasped the edges of the heavy blankets, pulling them slowly up over his legs, over his chest, and tucking them snugly beneath his chin. The weight of the woolen quilt was extraordinary, pressing down upon him with a firm, even pressure that felt like a long, protective embrace. It was a grounding weight, a physical barrier that separated him entirely from the waking world, trapping the warmth of his body in a perfect, cozy cocoon. He shifted slightly, finding the perfect hollow in the massive, feather-stuffed pillows, letting his head sink back until his neck was perfectly supported. He let out a long, slow breath, a deep sigh that carried the last remaining ounce of tension out of his lungs and into the quiet air of the room. He closed his eyes. Lying there in the warm darkness, Elias focused his attention on the subtle symphony of the sleeping castle. He could hear the gentle, familiar crackle and pop of the logs in his own fireplace, a soothing, crackling melody that was slowly winding down. Beyond the thick walls of his room, the castle was profoundly silent. Yet, if he listened very, very closely, he could feel it. Deep within the ancient stone, travelling up through the floorboards and into the frame of his bed, was the incredibly faint, rhythmic thrumming of Bram's slow, steady breathing. The gentle beast was still purring in his sleep, a distant, muffled vibration that acted as a heartbeat for the entire fortress. a constant reassuring reminder that the gentle guardian was keeping watch, that the castle was safe, and that all was perfectly well. Against the thick leaded glass of his window, Elias could hear the soft, almost imperceptible shh of the snow, the delicate brushing of a million tiny flakes accumulating softly against the panes, burying the world outside in a blanket of absolute stillness. The sound was hypnotic, a natural lullaby that whispered of endless peace and quiet isolation. A feeling of profound gratitude washed over Elias, warming him from the inside out. He thought of the restored book in the grand library, waiting patiently on its stand. He thought of the gentle giant, dreaming peacefully by the hearth. He thought of the deep, sheltering walls of the northern castle, holding back the winter and preserving the magic of quiet moments. His breathing slowed, matching the long, deep rhythm of the distant beast. His limbs felt incredibly heavy, melting softly into the luxurious depths of the feather mattress. The glowing red light of the fire danced faintly against the insides of his eyelids, slowly fading into a soft, comforting darkness. The chill of the northern night was a million miles away, locked outside the frosted glass. Here, in the heart of the ancient sanctuary, wrapped in layers of heavy wool and deep, abiding warmth, there was only the quiet. There was only the gentle rhythm of the fire. There was only the soft, descending path into a deep, unbroken, and perfectly peaceful slumber.